Peter and Paul, the two greatest apostles and fathers of the church, they had different missions, but the same objective. Peter was established as the head of the hierarchy. He is the one who has the final word on earth of matters regarding the faith and the morals, the doctrine of these two aspects of our living tradition. And Paul was given the mission of evangelizing the world, of bringing the Word of God, which was known and revealed to the Jews, which he was one of them. He brought that word out then to the world, to the Gentiles, to the nations. And the church has two, then, we can say, actions. And I'm taking these words from Father Krempa, who described it as the centripetal force of Peter, which brings things to the center, and where the maintaining the defense of and the clarification of the teaching of the church has its precedence there at the core. If it weren't for the centripetal action of the church would have just dispersed and become a collection of various sects more or less related to each other, and which we see in history then an example of that after the revolution of Henry VIII and Luther, both around the same time, breaking away from the church, breaking away from Peter, and drifting further and further from the tradition. And on the other hand, we have the necessary action, the centrifugal action of St. Paul, which then goes outward and spreads the truth. If it weren't for Paul's missionary action, and he evangelized the whole Mediterranean area, if it weren't for that extensive and energetic evangelization, Christianity might have just remained a small sect within Israel. So it takes both, and both of them are great gifts to the church. And this double mission, or twofold mission of the church, is also an analogy for something that happens within each one of us. We have to have a strong rooting in the tradition of the church. That doesn't mean necessarily in particular customs, although oftentimes customs are expressions of a tradition, of a faith. But to be faithful to the magisterium of the church, to the teaching, to the correct interpretation of the scriptures, all of which is clarified by the hierarchy of the church, beginning with the Pope and then with the cooperation of the bishops. So the hierarchical aspect is analogous to our necessary continual renewal of our belief and our understanding. We have to study and grow in our knowledge of the faith. And at the same time, we have to adapt. Paul, the centrifugal action of Paul, is analogous to our need to, as we confront reality, growing up from children into adulthood, faced with various situations that challenge us, we have to find out how to live our faith in a practical way. And that requires this action of expansion from certain clear and simple formulas stating the truth that we know to how we have to live it. And in the spiritual life, there are examples of this evolution of spirituality. It's not that what we believe evolves over time and changes. It grows, though. It becomes deeper. It becomes more extensive. And the way we live our spiritual life may change over time as well. We all probably, if you were born into a Catholic family with traditional faith, then you probably grow up learning the basic prayers, the Our Father, the Hail Mary, the Glory Be, the Rosary, and other prayers and practices that are very repetitive and stable. But over time, as we grow and our need to deepen our union with Christ increases, sometimes those are not sufficient completely to satisfy the hunger in our soul, and we have to learn other ways of praying and other ways of being part of the mission of the church, evangelizing, sharing our faith with others. So we learn techniques and practices such as meditation. It's not just a mere repetition anymore of a very accurate expression of faith, but more of a dialogue with God, conversation with God. And then, if we continue to grow, God may gift us with certain mystical experiences, contemplation, where there may not be any verbal communication happening, even interiorly, but just a resting in the Lord and an experience of His peace. So, the church in St. Peter and Paul, exemplified by them, has a great breadth of life. And it's not like, oh, all we need is Peter or all we need is Paul. Christ raised both of these great saints up to be His witnesses, and they cooperated. They cooperated, and at times they had to learn from each other. In particular, I'm thinking of the case where Peter, as I'm relating this idea of the centrifugal force and the maintenance of tradition, he was a little too stuck on or too comfortable in the Jewish tradition. He was making compromises that St. Paul pointed out were not entirely the will of Christ or the faithful interpretation of Christ's liberation from the Mosaic law. And so when Paul confronted him about allowing this perception that some of the Mosaic laws were still in force, he corrected him, and Peter, with the grace of God and affirming what Paul said, then did adhere to the new law without this overly rigid or static adherence to a tradition. But we need both. If it weren't for the tradition of the church, we might not still have the Mass today. The tradition of the Mass is essential and continues from the time of the Last Supper until today, and will continue until the end of the world, but perhaps not without grave challenges. As the church has known many persecutions, it is still being persecuted today and will be persecuted until the end of time. But Peter and Paul remained faithful through persecution. This feast is not explicitly to commemorate their martyrdom, but they were both martyrs. Peter died on a cross, and Paul was beheaded, both in Rome, the center of the worldly empire at the time that Christ conquered and made the center of the church on earth, Rome. So we remember these two saints who are both buried there, and from whom the Church continues to derive a spiritual impulse to be remaining both faithful to the tradition and courageously going out to those who have not yet known Christ and teaching them and also learning from them as the Church adapts to the peoples, to the points of view of various nations without ever changing the core beliefs. We ask Mary, who also exemplified these two aspects. On the one hand, she treasured all these words in her heart. That's the maintenance of tradition, the growing understanding of what we've received, and then also being able to adapt to whatever God inspires. When she said, do whatever he tells you. So we ask Mary to continue to inspire the leaders of the Church and all of us, every member of the Church, to be faithful and to give courageous witness and go out to the margins as Pope Francis teaches. St. Francis practiced that. And in this way, we will faithfully make our journey through this life and keep that tradition alive. Praise be Jesus and Mary.